What they do is not in the interest of those young Russian boys being slaughtered in the meat grinders of Ukraine. The decisions that Putin takes are in the interest of Putin personally. It's the privatization of power.
He's got $1 billion. People say he's got $1 billion sitting somewhere in the
Man's
bank
got a solid gold toilet.
Welcome to Thinkers on Times Radio, the show where we try and just take a slight step back, do things with a bit of length, a bit of distance and a bit of nuance, actually, try and understand some of the things that are shaping the world around us. Today, we're diving into a world where power floats free of truth and fantasy becomes the foundation of decision-making, with a really fantastic journalist and author. I admire his work greatly. He's called Tom Burgis. This is his latest book called Cuckooland. He really understands how the powerful work, and in fact, we live in a world more or less which is shaped by powerful men, mostly men, powerful men, who make decisions and control not only what they do, but also how we perceive what they do, which I think is the crux of a lot of what Tom writes about. Tom Burgis joins us now. Great to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
Tell us your central thesis, because we're always trying to explain the world, aren't we? And the world often results from things like power and how power transmits and is allowed to transmit. But you're arguing that people who are rich and powerful, they do more than just gather together riches for themselves. They're doing something about how they are perceived and how we see the truth about them.
I'd say I wouldn't. I'd be wary of saying I have a thesis. I'm a reporter, and I stick to that. And I think that's important. So I was a correspondent in various parts of the world. My longest stints were in Africa, and that's where I got into reporting on corruption, which I think is now the most powerful force in the world. And time and again, first in Africa, then in the former Soviet Union, and today in the big Western democracies, I think that corruption is taking over. If I have a thesis, I suppose it's that. And what does that mean? Obviously, there's a criminal definition of corruption, taking a bribe or paying a bribe, whatever it may be. But fundamentally, it means abusing public trust for private gain. And I think that is what we're witnessing, and how we can understand what we're seeing in our 100 miles an hour chaotically changing world is exactly that the power is becoming a tool of the powerful. We had a brief period where you could say that altruism reigned in a sense. That do
you really believe that there was a golden age? When was that? When did you think there was?
Well, I think you could see there was a shift in favour of collective interests after the Second World War.
Yeah.
So something like the NHS would be a product of that, or what we call the rules-based order.
Or the UN. I mean, we often talk about on this programme, on my radio programme, the UN actually has turned out to be largely useless in certainly dealing with major global issues, but it was created out of the notion that countries should work together in their collective interests.
Yeah, and I would say it has been largely useless on some of the really big ticket things. I mean, Rwanda would be a horrifying example, but then in the aftermath of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the UN teams of experts that go and investigate are the most brilliant and courageous operation for holding power to account in that godforsaken country. So yeah, the NHS, the UN, institutions like that, a sense of the rule of law spreading internationally. Golden age is probably going a bit too far, but a swing in that direction. You know, evolutionary biologists talk about the tension between cheats and altruists in any society. So things tip towards altruists, and now they're tipping back towards cheats. And what that means is that institutions are becoming tools of the powerful rather than shields for the many.
And you wouldn't say that's ever been thus then, because that's the cynic's answer to a lot of what you're saying, is that rich people have always been corrupt. They've always controlled the truth, or their version of the truth. They've tried to influence the media. They've tried to influence what is regarded as a fact and what isn't regarded as a fact. They've always had the most expensive lawyers to argue the case in court. Why has it got worse then, in your view? Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's been a brief moment where we've managed to rein in some of those powers. There are historically these brief moments on it where we managed to rein in the powerful. You look back to Wolf Hall, where a king is synonymous with the country, and you've got Henry VIII saying, "Well, I'm England, and I'm off with France today," by which he means not the country, he means the person.
Yeah.
So I stumbled into this idea of the privatization of power when I was covering Angola. So Angola, very little understood or written about in English or indeed any language. Portuguese-speaking, former kind of Soviet satellite, if you like, in southern Africa, hugely rich in oil, now a massive oil supplier to China, and somewhere where there was a terrible civil war, proxy war for 20 years, nightmarish conditions. And then the people who won the civil war, who are now the Angolan ruling elite, realised that they could sort of repurpose their war machine for kleptocracy, for rule through corruption. And there's a brilliant academic. He's kind of like the Indiana Jones of African political studies. Ricardo Soares de Oliveira is based in Oxford, who came up with this term, the privatization of power, when he was studying the kind of inner workings of the Angolan kleptocracy and how this handful, this clique, then known as the Futungu, after the presidential palace, which is situated next to a rubbish dump on which a million people live, how they use their place in the global economy to hoover up all the oil revenues for themselves, insulate themselves, and insulate their power. So violence when required, corruption the rest of the time. The rule of law is a sham. It's the courts are used to jail their enemies. The central bank is a sham. The finance ministry is a sham. It's a shadow state, if you like, where power has the outward trappings of institutions, sure, has the face of that, but the purpose of it is to enrich and protect those who wield that power. And it's that model, I think, that we've seen now spreading into the West, and that is Trump. That's Donald Trump style rule for me.
We're going to get to Donald Trump because I think that's interesting. Maybe the bridge between Angola, where you just talked about that, and Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. Because you see a country which was joined together by an ideology, communism breaks down, and then what you're talking about, it strikes me, a country run by gangsters, country run by private enterprise gone wrong. And is that true of Putin? Putin is there, now he might say he's got Russian pride and he's got Russian imperial pride even, but a large swathe of Putin's power rests in how much money he can take for himself and how much money he can distribute around a relatively small number of people. Yeah,
that's so important. I think we were talking a moment ago maybe about that, the idea of like a brief age of altruism. It's maybe slightly overstated, but where we would talk about countries acting in the national interest and global institutions acting in the interest of global humanity or even the planet as a whole. And those impulses were real, I think, in some cases. We keep using that language, even though that's not happening in places where that's not happening. So the leaders of Russia don't act in the national interest of Russia. The interest, it's not, what they do is not in the interest of those young Russian boys being slaughtered in the meat grinders of Ukraine. The decisions that Putin takes are in the interest of Putin personally. It's the privatization of power.
He's got $1 billion. People say he's got $1 billion sitting somewhere in a
man's got a solid gold toilet. Yeah. I write about it in Cuckooland because a lot of the engine of how this style of rule gets transmitted into the West is through that kind of fusion of Western capitalism and Russian gangster rule at the end of the Cold War. And I have an account of Putin's early days. You know, he's coming up. I mean, I don't mention his solid gold toilet lightly. You know, he would talk to people about how appalling the toilet was when he was growing up in what was then Leningrad. The rats in the flat, just the material privations that he went through and the humiliations of that. And then he gets to join the club. He gets to join the elite club of the Soviet Union, where you have access to wealth and privilege, the KGB. And that's what the KGB is for. Yeah, there's a bit of espionage. But I remember interviewing someone who was in the KGB in those late days of the Soviet Union. And you could never get any spying done because people were constantly on the phone with their next business hustle.
Yeah.
And you get this fusion of the KGB, the kind of red directors, so the kind of barons of the Soviet economy, and organised crime. And then flying in come the kind of Western management consultants and bankers charged with that kind of George Bush Senior hubris at the end of the Cold War, thinking we'll just remake Russia in our image. And up through this system comes Putin, who first and foremost is about his own material wealth. And we were so keen to believe that the shadow state of Western-style institutions around him was real, because, of course, that meant we could have the listings on our stock exchange and do the big corporate deals and have the big alliances that Blair and others wanted, that we fell for it. And I've been reporting from Ukraine, and what's happening in Ukraine is the military extension of the march of Putin's kleptocracy.
And we fell for it because maybe this is true more than ever after the financial crisis of 2008. We need money, and Western economies haven't grown since 2008. And I wonder whether, maybe you'll say there's always been this desire to get in bed with the rich and to look away at the more unsavory things and to allow our institutions to be corrupted by the money. But certainly post-2008, we needed the money. We don't make anything in this country. We need financial services to prosper. We need legal services to prosper. We need the city of London to grow and grow and grow. Was that a point at which really morality and ideology went out the window and things like Russian money became more and more welcome in London, or was it happening anyway?
I think that there was a thread through from the 80s of kind of the primacy of the individual, greed is good, the kind of Gordon Gekko approach to life, and the stripping back of regulation that went with that. Because a lot of this is about the practicalities of what you can get away with. So I try to tie it back to reporting where I can. I've done a lot of work looking at the Serious Fraud Office. And I think this answers your question, or part of that question in a way. Like the Serious Fraud Office is supposed to be the frontline defence for the UK, a nuclear power, a UN Security Council power, one of the world's biggest economies, one of, if not the most important stock markets in the world, the frontline defence against corruption and financial crime. This is what defends us against theft and fraud and so on. But also, I think, as we increasingly realise, kleptocracy and corruption are a weapon in the arsenal of the people who will invade Ukraine, the people who will butcher their enemies as the Saudis do in a foreign embassy and so on. So the Serious Fraud Office, I'm just trying to say, is seriously important.
Yeah, it's not nothing.
It's not nothing. But look at what it's actually like. Now, we've got great statutes, right? Really, really good money laundering laws. Really, there's a relative new anti-corruption law. It's tremendous. Like the statutes, the regulations, it's all tremendous on paper. But Ben Judah, who's a great student of kleptocracy and now advises David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, he has this great expression of a hologram state, where a little bit like Angola, I suppose, it looks fantastic on the outside, but you wade through it, there's nothing there. I speak to people who have worked in the Serious Fraud Office. They're going up against multinational corporations that make every 2 or 3 days their annual budget. I spoke to someone who was telling me about how, you go and do a raid, you'd stop some people getting off a plane at an airport that you suspected were involved in a big, important global corruption scheme. You would use they've got serious powers. They would take the laptops, they would take the phones, they would get them back to headquarters, the Serious Fraud Office. They would hand them over to the tech team, and they say, well, when can you image these? When can we process this information? They say, about 9 months. The tech doesn't work. The information security is a joke. The salaries are hopelessly low, so people will duck in. Really, really brilliant people will duck in for a while to do some civic service and then will leave. Again and again they've failed to do, because they're probably set up to fail, the big prosecutions. To come back to your question, what's the purpose of that? You could see that as a kind of a subliminal message to the kleptocrats of the world, saying, we will do the perfect thing. We will give you a kind of ersatz rule of law. We'll give you the facade of the rule of law. So, however much money you've stolen in Kazakhstan, it will kind of be protected here. It will be harder for the dictator in Kazakhstan, if he turns on you, oligarch A, to expropriate your assets once you've stuck them on the London Stock Exchange. So, the rule of law will function to that extent. Yeah. But the prospect of you going to jail for that massive theft and the thing you did with that gangster and the bribes you paid to get those mines far, far away, that's effectively zero. So that's the message, that's the revealed preference of our country.
Meanwhile, the big law firms make money out of representing people. The big finance firms make money. The accounting firms audit books. There's the industry on the back of this. I'm not criticising people who are doing that, but every single deal that gets done there's an entire bank of people who benefit from that.
Yes, I mean the take the Russian elite. The way that it's knitted itself into the British establishment and the British institutions of power is remarkable. I mean, I write about this a fair bit in Cuckooland, but political party donations, the use of law firms, yes, the use of city banks, donations to philanthropic causes, the overwhelming presence of cases from the former Soviet Union in the high courts. The one bit of the British legal system that works is the bit that's funded by Russia. Essentially, is the bit of the high court, often oligarch versus oligarch.
And we're kind of proud of that. We kind of say, people come to London because London has a good court service.
Yeah, but then the invasion of Ukraine happened, and we started to realise that this madness, where we tried to separate geopolitics from what goes on in our legal sector and our political system, was just the most extraordinary act of cognitive dissonance. And from one day to the next, we had, I think it was Priti Patel at the time, who was standing up saying, it's an outrage that all these people have been able to launder, all these people around Putin have been able to launder all these billions. But they've been going through her political party. They've been going through all the political parties. They've been going through schools and banks and so on and so on.
PR firms, the law firms.
The PR firms, the law firms. And this is where it comes to where we started, this question of the truth. I mean, this is what I'm trying to get to. The first book of mine was about corruption in Africa and how it gets corruption fueled by multinational corporations and oligarchs and so on, and how that ends in violence and the corruption of the state. The second book is about the kind of global networks of kleptocrats, and this latest one is about the truth. It's much more set in the UK. It's a product of the pandemic when we were all more stuck at home, and but it really does strike me that the ultimate power is controlling the truth, right? And how do you actually practically go about doing that? In the UK, the main thing you do is you hire one of those big reputation management law firms, Carter Ruck, Schillings, Mishcon de Reya, and so on. I mean, journalists, I mean, I still feel it myself, generally feel a shiver even saying those names out loud.
I know.
Because of the sheer power they have.
It's an interesting fact that we live in a world where a law firm is also a reputation management firm. That's itself a kind of strange development if you think about it, because law is at one level an objective process. Boy, here's the facts, we'll debate them, someone make up a decision. Reputation management is about shaping things in a way that's probably extra legal.
I think that the by far the biggest activity that reputation management firms do is almost entirely invisible. So we have these incredibly powerful firms charging enormous fees, all based around Chancery Lane. And their clients before the invasion of Ukraine have included lots of people who are now under sanctions. So we now deem to be monstrous. Roman Abramovich would be a good example. Igor Sechin, Putin's old buddy from KGB days. He was actually a KGB veteran of Angola. In fact, Putin's enforcer, and now a squillionaire running the Russian oil industry. These law firms, what they do is they take these clients, and if you try to write about them, you'll know this. I can see it in your eyes. Yeah. If you try to write about them, you will approach them in sort of good journalistic standards before publication. You would write to Abramovich or whoever it may be in some way. You try to get hold of him and say, look, we had these allegations about misconduct or whatever it may be. We want to give you a chance to comment. It's good, honest journalism. Maybe we've made a mistake. Maybe our sources have an axe to grind. Tell us your side of the story, so we can get this thing accurate. And you would get the letter back from the Schillings, Mishcons, Carter Ruck, one of these firms. And there's generally a pretty standard tone, which is absolutely ferocious disdain. It's like, you are a poor excuse for a journalist. This is shoddy. And the lingering threat is typically these emails. The reply wouldn't even go to you; it'd be sent to your editor, just so they can sort of badmouth you to the editor. And then the lingering in the background is a threat, and the threat is the fees of the law firms themselves. So the life-altering fees that the lawyers command, you're going to be on the hook for if they can show that you've somehow got something wrong, or if they can somehow pin you as like a dishonest journalist out to get the client, but malicious, biased, and you're instantly looking at $1 million. Right. I've been to court in one of these cases, and one thing it does is it takes you off the field of play for a long time. Catherine Belton, brilliant journalist, one of the best on Russia that we have, in the run up to the war in Ukraine, where we all would benefit from reading her writing about what Putin's up to, is instead dealing with 4 separate attacks on her brilliant book, Putin's People. Yeah. But what I was saying earlier, that the most what these firms really do is invisible. That their management of the truth is invisible. Is that there are these cases that get some press. So my one got a bit of press, and I went to court with Catherine. I went to Parliament with Catherine. And we talked about SLAPs, as they're called, lawfare, like strategic lawsuits against public participation, essentially using the law to crush legitimate scrutiny of public figures, of the powerful. But what really matters is all those cases we don't hear about. Yeah. So where the law firms succeed in silencing big and small, serious major news organisations and freelancers, and just obliterating really, really important information about the rise of kleptocracy. What I would say is the defining question of our time, shifting it all off the public record and essentially deciding what we all get to read.
And people can't understand it. We said earlier, Tom, we talked about Trump. How does Trump fit into this world? I mean, I don't know whether you want to go. I mean, the thing that occurred to me was there's a picture of Donald Trump when he was inaugurated, and he's in the rotunda, and there's every single tech bro with him. And it struck me that I think in human history, there's never been a photograph or image or painting or image containing more money and power in the history of the world than that moment there, when you have a new president with 7 of the tech giants of the world, which basically, and I wonder whether that's an interesting link we're making here, which is, I'm not accusing them of malfeasance, but just saying, if you control, or if you're in bed with the people who communicate via social media and tech, you control the truth. And if you can control the truth, you can control anything. I wonder if that's what we're seeing with Donald Trump. Donald Trump 1.0, all the tech people laughed at him. And Facebook and places like that were hotbeds of anti-Trump mentality. Trump 2.0 is in bed with all of them. I wonder if that will have an impact on things.
I think that where Trump fits into this world is just very simple. He's a kleptocrat too. So I think this is the best way of understanding, for instance, his relationship with Putin. There are very interesting reports of contacts between Trump and Russian intelligence over the years. That's, for me, still a live question, the extent of those contacts and the extent to which those relationships have influenced how Trump has behaved. But I think the best way of understanding it is through the money. Yeah. And I wrote about this in Kleptopia, my book. For Trump is a failed businessman. A failed businessman who was frittering away daddy's money through bankruptcy after bankruptcy. And then 2 things happen: reality TV and the implosion of the Soviet Union. And you get the theft of the Soviet economy by a handful of oligarchs who then want to park that wealth somewhere safe. And the number one repository for that wealth is New York real estate.
Real estate, yeah.
And who should be the face of New York real estate but Donald Trump, who's been able to reinvent himself as a successful businessman because he can go on reality TV and pretend to be that, and people will lap that up. So these 2 phenomena come together. And from then on, so from the early noughties really, again and again and again, you see Russian organised crime in his properties. You see very dubious fortunes from all over the former Soviet Union pouring into his properties. He's just leasing out his image, his fake image as a successful businessman, and his name. And he takes a cut of that, and he doesn't ask questions about where the money comes from. And that is what sustains Trump. So whether or not there is some more kind of conscious relationship with Russia, he knows where his bread is buttered. And he operates like a kleptocrat. Nigeria was the place I lived the longest, the kleptocracy I lived in the longest. And you come into an election there, and all the chat and all the bars is like, right, who's going to stay out of jail? So someone's term is coming up. They will have, of course, been stealing as much money as they can because Nigeria's been hollowed out and corrupted by the oil industry. So, okay, they've been stealing loads of money. Could they just hop to a job in the Senate? And it's all about maintaining your immunity from prosecution. The run-up to this election was just the same. Yeah.
For Trump.
For Trump. It was just about staying out of jail.
And for Netanyahu, people say the same thing about Netanyahu.
100%.
That partially one of the reasons he wants to prolong the war with Hamas is because at the end of that process, he might go to jail. And he wants to avoid that.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfectly rational evidenced view of what's happening there. And I think this comes back to this point of the privatization of power. Like, this is how we must understand what's going on here, through the individual interests of these powerful people who are not held to account.
The distinction between, and we were talking about this with Anne Applebaum last week, but the distinction with Trump is that, unlike Putin, doesn't have to be popular because he's a dictator, effectively. He's corrupted democracy to the extent that there is no democracy. Xi in China doesn't have to be popular. Donald Trump has to do whatever he wants to do in his own interest, but he also had to get elected. He did get elected, and that must mean something. And one of the things it might mean, he's managed to find a way of controlling the narrative, and that's possibly via social media. The tribalism attendant upon Trump is another factor in all of this, though. This is the question of what you're talking about all throughout this is truth. Who owns the truth? Mm-hmm. And in an ideal world, which doesn't really exist, the truth is an objective thing that we try our hardest to get to, and by a sort of process of arguing one way, arguing on the other, we get to some sort of approximation of it, and we respect authority when authority should be respected, and we go after authority when authority has gone too far.
Absolutely.
That's the ideal. The reality is, you pick a team, you control the means of communication, and that team grows and grows and grows and grows and might become so big that you can do anything you like. Donald Trump's argument, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, and no one would bat an eye.
I think the crucial word I think that's very insightful. I think the crucial word you use is tribal. So the reason I got into, however long ago it was now, 15 years, really trying to understand corruption was covering one massacre in central Nigeria. I wrote about it in my first book, The Looting Machine. And it was nightmarish. There was a village being burned, the children being killed, and so on. And I was there to see the immediate aftermath of when they were burying the bodies. And often massacres in central Nigeria, people turn up, right, 300 words, move on. That's the news. And I got pretty obsessed with it and tried to understand the kind of tectonics underneath it, what was happening, why had the people from one village burned the babies of another village. And the answer I ultimately found was corruption. So the local governor, a guy called Jonah Jang, he, like every Nigerian governor, almost without exception, his interest was to try to maintain his status among the rich rather than the droves of the poor by stealing everything he could using political office. When a whole political system is based on corruption, like the Russian one, there is no appeal to the people you can make. You can't say, look at my record on building roads, because there is no road, because your mate stole the contract. You can't say, look at my record on delivering schools, because everyone has to pay a little bribe to get their matriculation certificate at the end of their school career, because the system has been completely corrupted from the top down. So the only appeal you can make for any sort of loyalty, and this comes back to your point about being popular, you still have to have some affinity of the people. Otherwise, the only option is kind of complete totalitarian rule, which is expensive and difficult and rarely achieved. People still have to want you to rule them in some corrupted way. And if there's no appeal if you can't make an appeal based on public service, also if the tax system breaks down and people aren't funding the government, you're just relying on bribes and resource industries, it really does just boil down to, are you with me or against me? And that's where racial, ethnic, tribal politics comes in, and that's why villages burn in Central Africa.
And that's why Putin arguably can invade Ukraine, because he talks to a myth of we're having this conversation near VE Day. He talks about the story of the Great Patriotic War and the problems of Nazis in Western Europe.
Yeah.
And so and he controls the media, and he controls social media, but he is appealing. Your point is a really good one. He's not saying, I'm doing this and it's just the secret police killing everyone will stop you.
Yeah, screw you. Yeah.
He does a bit of that, but he's also basically saying, here's a myth, here's a narrative to believe in. Yeah. And I'm going to, and Trump does the same sort of thing. Here's the make America great again, and I'm going to, even if the facts don't accord to the narrative, I'm going to sell the narrative so hard, people will believe it.
There's a word I've got in the Cuckooland, vranyo, a Russian word, that means it's best defined as You're a powerful figure, Stig. You are a powerful figure, of course. But just imagine for a second you're an even more powerful. You're still more powerful.
Give me 20 seconds to at least enjoy that. Go on.
And you're saying, you're making a pronouncement about, let's say, the war in Ukraine, which you've launched, and I know you're lying. I know it's. But it's in, and you know that I know you're lying. But it's better for my health to proclaim that I believe you, and for you to proclaim that you believe that I believe you. And this Russian term "vranyo" is fantastically useful. You see you see Putin start to adopt the narratives of the Orthodox Church and so on. Yeah. Once you have those mass rallies triggered largely by corruption. You see him start to demonize Navalny when he starts digging into corruption. Litvinenko is killed because he's we still don't know entirely why, but he certainly was looking into Putin's corruption at the time. You need the narrative that we are I am the leader of the collective interest, the altruistic interest, to mask the fact that you are the cheat. But you come to the States then, and this is what Trump's doing. Trump's is just an entirely tribal narrative. Right, it's largely a white nationalist narrative, but it's the same model as Jonah Dang is using in the US. It was using in that Nigerian state in central Nigeria. You talk about controlling the press, that becomes the crucial thing, right? You have to, if you want to have this Vranyo system where we all say what the boss thinks we want to say. The obstacles to that are science and a free press. So whether it be through London law firms, or Trump's just demonizing of the press, or increasingly just violence against journalists. I mean, that's been a lot of the places where I've worked. That's just a fact of life. The incredibly brave local journalists in Nigeria or Kazakhstan or wherever it may be will just be killed, and we are heading in that direction. I mean, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta blown up in a car bomb. Other journalists are dying. The rate at which journalists are dying, huge numbers of them in Gaza, of course, is going through the roof. And Cuckooland is about the kind of, if you like, softer, less kinetic ways of crushing the press. But my worry is that soon journalists in the West are going to start to have to adapt to the kind of threats that our colleagues in rougher and readier places have faced for a long time. Surveillance is already rife. Threats against journalists is already rife. We are moving into repression. It's like boiling a frog, right? You don't notice until it's too late.
Well, listen, Tom, that alone is a reason why people should read your stuff and listen to what you've just said. But I think that over the last half an hour, the way you've been able to sort of link together, very disparate geography, different characters, different times, but all modern times. I think it's really chilling in lots of respects, but it's so important.
Well, I hope it makes some sense.
It makes some sense. Making sense, that's what we try and do. That's what you've done brilliantly. The book is called Cuckooland. For people who are interested in it. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, that was a real pleasure, thank you.
Really interesting stuff as ever. That's it for this episode of Thinkers here on Times Radio. You know what to do. If you've got some comments on it, go beneath the line. I know you'll always be respectful and thoughtful and add to the greater sum of human knowledge. We'll be doing this again. Make sure you hit follow and subscribe. Stay with us as we go on having these sort of conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.